Welcome back to the Leverage Podcast, where our goal is simple: to learn from the best and discover how we can all live a better life, build a more fruitful business, and be more productive. Join us each week as we interview fellow entrepreneurs, thought leaders, and leading experts to discuss everything from marketing secrets to new technology and life as an entrepreneur.
Hello, and welcome back to the Leverage Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Sonnenberg, and thanks for tuning in. This episode is brought to you, as always, by the Leverage team. Leverage, my company, is a tech-enabled growth agency that helps small to medium-sized businesses with marketing, growth, and operational efficiency. We take a high-level approach with each business we work with, examining your top and bottom line growth strategies. Now, that means focusing on the obvious things like marketing and content strategies, but also the not so obvious things like optimizing internal tools, processes, getting set up to be remote, etc. So if you need some help growing the top and bottom lines of your business, head to getleverage.com/podcast/66 for today's episode. And we have a form there that you can fill out, and we'll be in touch to help discuss how we can help you grow. That call would be totally free, no obligations. So just get in touch and have a conversation and see where we might be able to fill in some gaps. On this episode of the podcast, I'm sitting down with Yael Eisenstat. She's an expert on the effects of social media on democracy, and she has a whole slew of impressive titles that we'll get into in just a bit. Yael has some interesting thoughts on the intersection of ethics, democracy, and technology, especially because she's got years of experience working deeply with governments, tech companies, and investors. For me, this was a refreshing conversation because I'm usually focused on productivity and efficiency, but really my background's in data science. So being able to geek out with someone on how data is used in various aspects now of our day-to-day life was a very stimulating and interesting conversation. One final note is that this interview was actually recorded on July 30th, 2020, so a couple months ago. And even though it's a few months old, the content's extremely relevant today, perhaps even more relevant as we're getting closer to the election. And since the recording of this, Yael has a TEDtalk that's out, which I highly recommend. It was excellent. You can go to her website, Yael Eisenstat, YaelEisenstat.com. You can see her TED Talk there. And also, I've been watching a movie on Netflix that is extremely interesting. I haven't finished it yet, but it's called The Social Dilemma, and it's very relevant to the conversation that Yael and I had a few weeks ago. So enjoy the show, and as always, feel free to share, subscribe, rate, comment. We're always excited to hear from people. So enjoy the show. Welcome back to the Leverage Podcast. Today we have a unique and interesting guest. It's a recent friend of mine we met through John Levy through his influencers network, and that is Yael Eisenstat. Yael is a visiting fellow at Cornell Tech, was hired by Facebook to help with election integrity, former CIA officer and White House advisor. Also has a new project with Beta Labs, part of betaworks here in New York, which I'd love to learn more about, and is really passionate about how social media affects democracy. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's the highlight reel. You got it right.
All right. Well, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Obviously, we met, you spoke at one of John's events, and I was really impressed with your story, with things that you had to say. I just watched the movie, The Great Hack. For those listening that haven't watched it, it's an interesting documentary all around how data influenced the election. And your talk was really interesting. I come from a data science background, so I appreciated it. Why don't you, if you wouldn't mind, give a quick few-minute background, share whatever parts of your story you're allowed to share, feel comfortable sharing, what you're up to, what you're interested in these days, and then we'll just take it from there.
I joined government and started the process in 1999. So yes, I'm old. My goal in life at that point, it was a pre-September 11th world. It was really just to sort of see what the US's place on the global stage is. Really a global thinker, wanted to be overseas, wanted to help sort of work on foreign policy and global affairs issues. So I spent about 13 years in government and worked a lot in Africa and mostly in Africa, as well as Washington, of course. And the highlight of my government career was, as you mentioned, when I did get to spend time as one of the national security team advisors at the White House. But I transitioned out of government in 2013. And when I did, my goal was really to see what the private sector brings to bear on some of these really big challenges that I was working on in government. My first little detour was an odd one. I actually moved to Texas and went to ExxonMobil to work on corporate social responsibility issues there because they have a profound impact in the world. And I really wanted to see if there was a way to help the company sort of work better with local communities. In 2015, I came back to New York and really started, as someone who had always focused overseas, it really started to get me concerned. This breakdown in civil discourse here in the US, this just what seemed to be this more and more polarizing environment we were in. So I started sort of digging in on what was happening here, which was a shift for me because I'd always focused overseas. This whole shift into the tech industry started with this piece I wrote in late 2015, early 2016, where I was really concerned. I wrote a piece exploring why it had been easier for me to have an open conversation with suspected terrorists along the Somalia border than it was for me to talk to Americans on the opposite side of any political issue for me. And that was a real stark wake-up call for me that something was really happening. So I kind of wrote it as this like wake-up call warning to America about everything, we talk about now, how this polarization was really threatening our democracy. And so I started speaking out, and oddly enough, I started getting invited to keynote like these global tech conferences, which at the time was funny for me because I'd never worked in tech. So I think the first one was in Berlin. It was Tech Open Air. It was a wonderful, wonderful tech conference. And I spoke about the unintended consequences of going more and more online and losing the ability for face-to-face civil discourse and what social media was doing to us. Then Facebook called. And so I agreed hesitantly with lots of caveats in 2018 to go to Facebook. They gave me this shiny title of Global Head of Elections Integrity Operations on the political advertising side. And I'm sure we'll get into some details during the conversation, but I did leave about 6 months later. And ever since, have spent the last, 2 years at this point, really trying to help raise awareness about how the current social media landscape is affecting both our civil discourse and our democracy, and particularly in the lead up to this election in November. So that's what I do at Cornell Tech, their Digital Life Initiative. I work on issues of, for me, it's really about accountability in tech, accountability for what the tech platforms are doing, and that intersection between technology and democracy. And then we can get into the Beta Labs things, which I just started. Beta Lab is this cool new initiative here in New York, seed funding for really early stage startups, looking to fix some of these issues that I'm sure you and I are going to speak about disinformation, about the lack of trust, privacy, all these things.
Just backing up in your story, what was the reason why you left government when you decided to leave government and go to a private sector?
So at that point in time, I had had an amazing career. I'd been all over the world. I was one of these people who, strangely enough, worked in like 4 or 5 different government agencies. Really had a very well-rounded, interesting life. After the role at the White House, there were 2 things. Part of it was I almost felt like, where do I go from here? But also I really wanted to see, I just had this desire to see how is the private sector really playing into these really big global challenges. I had done I started before September 11th. Our whole career went in a different direction a little bit after September 11th. But I'd spent so much time really sort of doing counter-extremism work, what we call hearts and minds work. And I knew what the power of the US government was, and I wanted to see what the power of the private sector was. And other reasons. Maybe I was a bit burnt out. Maybe I wanted a slightly less secretive life. There's lots of personal reasons too. But I never thought I'd say CIA out loud, right? So I was also keeping this part of who I was just kind of buckled up. And so all of those reasons. It's interesting because that was 7 years ago now? And I'll say I've had an amazing career outside of government, really huge challenges I've worked on. There is one thing missing, and it's that I've never found that sense of mission and purpose again that I had in government. So there's pros and cons to both worlds.
Are you thinking of going back?
If you'd asked me that a few years ago, I would have said no. But again, it's funny. I mean, maybe Facebook pushed me a bit in this direction, but I know at Facebook, they think they're so mission oriented, right? Their mission is to connect the world. And I think a lot of people are really passionate about that. And that's great. But nothing I was doing there or elsewhere felt truly as mission oriented, in part because in government, your client is the American people. Your client is not shareholders. Your job is not about maximizing profit. Your job is about actually trying to help and serve people. And I haven't found that again. I might consider going back someday, possibly. That was a long-winded answer. I'm too nervous to think about anything ahead of November, so I can't really. We'll see what happens.
The movie The Great Hack, are you able to say whether that was accurate, whether that was portraying, really what's happening behind the scenes?
Sure. I'm happy to talk about that. And also feel free to just feel comfortable. I'm very good at saying I can't answer that if you ask me something.
All right. So, yeah.
I don't want to make you nervous. I might have to kill you afterwards, but I don't want to make you nervous.
I'm sure you can. And we live close to each other, so I don't want to get a knock at the door.
The Great Hack was an excellent movie. In full disclosure, I know quite a few people that were in the movie. But listen, a movie is a movie. It's always going to have some things that people will think is a bit sensationalized. But at the end of the day, the movie did an excellent job of really showing people why it matters how the platforms use their data and what in the wrong hands can actually be done with it. And I just think it did a great job of raising awareness of what it means to be manipulated by these companies, that it's not just about them having your data. It's about really using human behavioral data to try to manipulate the way you act, the things you do, the products you buy, and the people you vote for. And so, yeah, I actually thought the movie did a really good job showing all of those issues.
I'm not an expert at this. I'm interested to learn during this. Data, obviously, there's a lot of good things that people can do with data. You could get better suggestions for something that you can buy that you need, and you could get better information that you're really, truly interested in. So data can be used in very good ways. Obviously, the manipulation side of it and having, behind the scenes some agenda that, and you're trying to sway, what are those people called that they were in? There was a term in the Great Hack. The persuadables, right? So obviously there's pros and cons to this, and it's a tricky topic. Is the core of the issue, at least in regards to Facebook, is it like whether it's classified as a media company? Is that kind of one of the core kind of foundational questions that impacts how the data is used?
Well, you went right to the heart of like the issue I care most about, but I'm going to get really wonky on it. The idea of them being classified as a media company. Let me back up a step before we get to that. Yes, of course, data can be used for good and bad. Absolutely. I mean, data is everything. The better the data, the more likely we are to solve the COVID crisis. I mean, of course, data can be used for good. And this is part of why I don't like this false narrative about how people who speak up against some of the negative consequences of tech are part of a techlash or hate tech. That is absolutely not the case. But everything in the world can be both good and bad. It doesn't mean that we just say, well, because there's some good, we can just let anything go. You figure out what the bad is and you protect against that, while hopefully unleashing a healthier environment for the good. That was obviously not a detailed comment, but it's not about not being able to use data. It's about how you collect it, what kind of data you're collecting, how you connect it to other pieces of data, how you then use it to persuade behavior, and what kind of behavior we're okay with it persuading. Going to your second question, the one about how should they be classified? I don't think that's actually the question that connects directly to the data, but it's the question that actually connects the most directly to what I care about the most. And that's that this is an industry who's really, for me, what upsets me the most is that responsibility has never been defined for much of the tech industry, especially the social media online platform industry. I don't mean the parts of the tech industry that are building actual physical products or have actual real customers in the world. There's some, of course, responsibility around the things they're doing. But because we've had this environment since, the question about media goes back to Section 230. I'm trying not to get overly wonky, but that's what the whole debate. Section 230 it was written in 1996, and it's basically, in a nutshell, a blanket immunity for platforms to say that they will not be held responsible for the content of third-party users, meaning you tweet something as long as it's not actually breaking the law. Like the best example would be as long as it's not a copyright infringement. That would be one way you can't. Twitter's not responsible for what you tweet. You are. So on the surface, that makes sense, right? Like it makes sense that you don't want to hold, otherwise a bunch of companies would never be able to even operate, right? Like if I'm using Squarespace to build a website and I'm just using their software and their platform, Squarespace should not be responsible for what I put on the website I build. But
sounds logical.
It's totally logical. And there's a second part to Section 230 as well, but that's not getting into your question. And that's about protecting content moderation. But to the point of whether they're a media or a platform, the reason that question is so critical is because if lawmakers decide that Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or any of these companies are actually media, are actually publishers instead of platforms, then they lose that Section 230 immunity. And so that's why that is so critical. For me personally, my personal opinion is that they are neither a publisher nor a platform. And we are twisting ourselves into trying to fit this entire debate. And it is a debate now because President Trump actually put out an executive order to try to get rid of Section 230. So it's not just a small debate right now. For me,
so do you think like a new category has to be created?
Absolutely. And so I think we're twisting ourselves into this whole thing of trying to fit all these tech companies into outdated laws and into two categories, the two categories that existed in 1996. And I would argue in 1996, nobody anticipated, I shouldn't say nobody, but they weren't anticipating a company whose algorithms could steer society in different directions. It's not about the content that's on their platform. It's about how their recommendation engines are steering you towards certain content. And so I think a new category, neither publisher nor platform, but something like a digital curator, something that actually encaptures what they actually are, because I don't want them regulated the same way as the New York Times. The New York Times has to fact check before they can put out articles. They are the gatekeepers between what is supposed to be true and what is not. I don't want Mark Zuckerberg to fact check every single time I post something. That's ridiculous. But I want him held responsible if his algorithms boost and amplify the most divisive or dangerous content in order to keep us engaged, in order to make money. That is not the same thing as saying that he's responsible for the piece of content I actually post.
So do you think like a third party neutral, what was the term you used? Data.
Like a digital curator or something like
that. So would that be like a third party data curator that certain things would have to run through to get approval before it kind of hits the platforms?
Not necessarily. I think it's more about if there had to be, so for me, and I don't know if this fits neatly into Section 230, that's the other thing. People who don't want to have this debate like to say, but that doesn't apply to Section 230 as a way to throw out the whole debate. I think we need a whole new set of rules around the internet, rules that figure out how to protect free speech. And this is the other thing. People love to say that people like me are anti-free speech. Unlike Mark Zuckerberg, I swore an oath to protect the Constitution. I actually swore an oath to protect free speech. So this is not about me not liking free speech. It's about, I think we need to create a mechanism for transparency and accountability around how your recommendation engines and your algorithmic amplification is happening. And the way you could do that, I mean, there's multiple ways, but government should have some sort of oversight. It doesn't mean you have to give up your secret sauce. It doesn't mean that you have to open up for everyone to see how you algorithms work. But can I give you an example just to sort of break it down? I know that people like to classify people as technologists or not. I like to talk about this in a way that hopefully non-technologists can understand. Here's an example. Recently, we had this situation. Are you familiar with the Boogaloo Boys?
No.
Great. I'm going to scare you a little bit then.
Right.
So the Boogaloo Boys are this group. I would call them a hate group. Other people would call them other things. They're basically a group of mostly men who believe in the next civil war in the United States. And, they're a white supremacist group that believe in creating the next civil war. And
I just had Daryl Davis on the show yesterday. Do you know Daryl?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know him, but I've seen him speak. They wear Hawaiian shirts. That's like their emblem. And they are rampant on Facebook. And so there was a situation where these two Boogaloo Boys members met up in Oakland during the Black Lives Matter protest and exploited the protest to go kill a federal officer. Now, why am I bringing this up as the example? Can I ask you 3 questions? See, now I'm turning the interview around on you. Let's see how you feel about this.
I might have to kill you, but yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So here's the first question. Do you think that Facebook should be responsible for the fact that the Boogaloo Boys are vibrant on its platform? Now, you don't have to answer that. I'm just saying that's the first question, and it's a tough one.
Yeah.
I actually see both sides of the debate. I don't take a stance on that because freedom of speech. They should be able to spout their hatred even if I don't like it. I can understand that argument, and I can also understand the argument that says no, they shouldn't.
I would say that they should be able to post, but then it becomes pretty gray area around if Facebook should be profiting.
There you go.
You're algorithms.
You're jumping ahead to my second question. Okay. So of course, question number 2 is in court documents. Again, remember that these 2 men killed a federal officer. In court documents, it shows that these 2 men actually met in a Facebook group. So the second question would be, what if you found out that one or both of those men didn't find that Facebook group on their own? They found it because it was recommended to them by Facebook. This is the group that these 2 men met in, hatched out their plan, and then went and killed a federal officer.
I mean, I still don't think that Facebook should. I mean, it's like, what if McDonald's showed an ad about something and then 2 people went to McDonald's because of some TV commercial and then they hit it off and decided to go and kill a bunch of people? I mean, that's like probably not the.
That's really a different situation. We're talking about a platform that I am looking at content and it says you may be interested in this group, and it steers me towards an extremist group. And in that group, I then go into Messenger and actually hatch out my plan to go murder somebody in Facebook Messenger with another member who I was connected to. Now, we will never know if these 2 men were connected to each other because of Facebook's algorithms, because it's a black box. My idea is that when something like that happens, if there was more transparency, even if it's just a government oversight committee that gets to actually get that data, that shows that it's not that these men were looking for that organization or group. Your recommendation engines pushed them towards that. To me, there's a poison there. There's a poison in this idea of Facebook's just a mirror to society. To me, that's absolutely untrue statement. Yes, there are many terrible people in the world. I know my whole career has been about kind of working on some of the issues of the most terrible people in the world. But if the recommendation engines of YouTube or any of these companies are taking me further and further down a path of things that I wasn't even there to look for to begin with, because they know their algorithms have figured out that that's how I'm going to stay on their platform.
I guess also the argument here would be, I mean, these are bad people to begin with. So did that algorithm really cause all that chaos, or was it just bound to happen no matter what?
I would be careful with the statement, these are bad people to begin with. There's lots of evidence out there of people who were actually made more and more extreme because of the rabbit hole they went down. I mean, I used to work on counter extremism issues overseas. I saw the same thing with like vulnerable youth 20 years ago that we were, this is the whole point of Hearts and Minds work, that we were trying to sort of get to know and get to like help before they were taken down this path. It's you find their vulnerabilities, you exploit their vulnerabilities, you make them feel special, you make them feel wanted, and you pull them more and more down a path. I would argue that saying that anyone that completely absolves any responsibility from a company that, okay, let's take something that doesn't involve murder. What about a teenage girl that's going onto YouTube to look at bathing suits and like within 2 video recommendations, she's being recommended videos on bulimia. Like to say that these companies are just showing you what you want to see is absolving them of all responsibility for the fact that they're using your human behavioral data. They're using everything about your human weaknesses to draw you in and suck you in and keep you engaged and keep your eyes on their screens, because whether they continue to say this is not true, their metric for success is user engagement. I know Mark Zuckerberg made this whole speech yesterday about how it's about healthier engagement. Look at their quarterly earnings reports. They still report out user engagement, and it's still about user growth, daily active users, monthly active users. And the only way to keep people truly engaged is to play to that part of our brain. And whether or not, I'll even take your argument, whether or not you think those people were bad to begin with, it still does not absolve the responsibility of U.S. government's job is to protect us from the things that are harmful. It's like saying, well, that person was just a bad driver, he deserved to die. Putting in a seatbelt, I mean, that he was a bad driver anyway. Well, yeah, maybe he was a bad driver, but putting in a seatbelt is still something that we should do to help protect him from dying. So it's to me, it's you cannot diagnose whether every single person that has been brought down some extreme path or brought down some dangerous path due to a rabbit hole they went down on YouTube.
Well, I see that point. I mean, it's like people join gangs, they were either persuadable or had some upbringing and they were searching for connection, and, that led them down a certain path. But do you think that the problem's the algorithm, or do you think that those types of groups should just be shut down from Facebook altogether?
Well, so that's where it gets complicated. That goes back to the first question. I do think the most extreme group should be shut down, right? For sure. I think if it is an absolute extreme group that is advocating violence, that is advocating breaking the law, yeah, your platform should not be hosting that content. It's a much fuzzier line when it's groups that I might disagree with, groups I might find despicable, but aren't actually breaking the law, then no. I mean, if Facebook decides they don't want them on their platform, that's their right. Do I think that the US government should intervene and tell them they should take them down? Absolutely not. But again, I am not as concerned with regulation around telling a platform what they can and can't host, because that would infringe on the First Amendment, except for obviously in illegal stuff. I'm not talking about intellectual property or child exploitation, like absolute illegal stuff. There's no question. But I would rather see the US government impose liability or responsibility on how the platforms profit off of that, how they amplify it. Listen, just because somebody tweets something or posts something that I disagree with, that's great. I mean, that's their right. But do they have the right to be amplified to 3 billion people because the algorithm figured out that what they posted is engaging and salacious? That's where the problem is. I mean, like, Aza Raskin and Renee DeResta made the comment freedom of speech isn't freedom of reach, famous a few years ago. And I still think that is one of the best ways of really looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, there's freedom of speech, but you should also have freedom of your own attention span. So if people are removing your ability to choose where you put your attention because things are just being forced in front of you, that's another issue, right?
Well, it is, but in addition, I don't want to go down the whole attention economy path right now. There are plenty of people who really focus on that part of it more than I do. But this whole idea of Section 230, this whole idea of like hands-off blanket immunity has gone so far that victims, real victims, don't even get a day in court because everything gets thrown out based on Section 230 immunity. And yes, I get it. Everyone's afraid that these companies should be bogged down in never-ending lawsuits. Of course, I think we have to think about it in a smart way. I don't believe we should just get rid of Section 230. Never have I believed that. But to say that victims shouldn't ever have their day in court is also ridiculous. I mean, look at, for example, let me go more in like in a different direction with this. So there's, and I'm not an expert on the case, but there was a housing discrimination case because it is illegal to discriminate in housing. It is illegal in the United States to prevent Black people from access to rent or buy in a certain neighborhood. Let's just go with the most extreme example. And there's a case where it was shown that Facebook's ad tools was allowing real estate folks and people advertising for housing to actually use categories that would eliminate certain races from seeing those ads. Now, that to me is very different than what you and I are talking about. To me, that's just blatant, right? Your tools, your advertising tools that you have created and that you also profit off of are letting housing ads be targeted towards white people or towards Black people. I mean, the US government sued them for this. But I will say their argument in court continues to be, oh, but we're immune from that. Section 230, we're immune from what our algorithms do. That's how far it's gone. You created actual tools. You might be immune from what other people post on your platform, but do you think they should be immune from the actual tools that they built and are giving to advertisers? Which, by the way, it's not just in housing. Those same tools are what the Russians used as well to completely manipulate our election. To me, the idea that it's this never-ending, don't touch tech, don't touch these platforms. If you even start to chip away at their blanket immunity, then they'll all die. I'm sorry. These are some of the biggest companies in the world. If they can't figure out how to clean up their act and clean up their recommendation engines and actually clean up their targeting tools so that we can still allow, yes, there will always be dirty stuff on their platform. I'm not saying there won't be. But it doesn't mean that they have to profit off of amplifying it and making sure that we all get to see the things that keep our eyes on the screen the absolute longest, and that we're targeted and even micro-targeted with certain harmful content. That's the difference.
Yep. Going into this election, do you think that there's been any cleanup since the last election, or do you foresee the same issues that we saw in 2016 happening again?
There has been some cleanup. I actually think Thread is different now. So when I was hired there, it was 2018. I came in just as actually the offer came the same day that Zuckerberg was testifying on the Hill. So it was right in the middle of all that chaos. They absolutely, they have huge integrity teams working to protect the platform from these issues. They've done some really good work, particularly trying to protect against foreign interference. But the two things that they haven't done, so yes, I'm happy to see that they're attempting to verify. No, they're never going to be able to be perfect at this, and I don't expect them to be able to be. But sure, I think it's great that you now actually have to reside in the country that you are running political ads in. That to me seems like a no-brainer. Those are the types of things they fixed.
And they can't still hack that with VPNs and other things?
Well, that's the thing. There's a difference between wanting Facebook to be perfect at all of it and just wanting Facebook to make the right effort, at least. That's my point. They're never going to be able to protect perfectly. But The difference now is it's actually, in my opinion, more challenging. So they created, these ads integrity rules for the political advertising side. They've obviously done a lot on the organic content side. They've set up new policies. But the thing that most critics are screaming about is their business model. And that's the one thing they will never touch and never change. And so all of these other things they're doing are these whack-a-mole, never-ending, tinkering around the margins responses, which they'll have to continue to do. But they have never actually looked at the underlying systemic issue that's causing this all. But we won't be able to do that before November. So in terms of this election, the bigger threats now are actually domestic. I mean, domestic actors learned very well from how foreign actors exploited the platform in 2016, and they're doing it now. I mean, I try not to get too partisan because to me, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, it's what this is doing to our overall democracy. That said, we have a president right now, just this morning, again, tweeted about mail-in ballots being fraudulent. And again, that is absolutely an untrue statement. And it is what I call a soft form of voter suppression. It's not clear-cut voter suppression. It's not telling people to vote on November 4th when the election's actually on November 3rd. But it is intention that, well, that's clear-cut voter suppression. And that's what happens. And Facebook's okay at catching that. Like, they'll likely catch those. But what do you do when the president is using the biggest platforms in the world to consistently sow distrust in our electoral process so that more and more people don't even believe in the process? Is that something a platform should protect about? What about when you have coordinated and authentic behavior that's boosting certain sites? I mean, just look at Kevin Roos's daily tweet about what the most engaging sites on Facebook are. They're like 3 or 4 of them, and they're all these right-wing sources that have all these networks of coordinated and authentic behavior boosting them. Those are the things they're not tackling. And we are going to arrive at November 3rd in a situation where half the population doesn't even trust the election, where the most powerful man in the world is using that, well, assuming the US president is the most powerful man in the world, is using the very tools that these companies have provided to him to sow that discord. And also, if he wants, can continue to use these micro-targeting tools on the advertising side to send you and me totally different messages that you and I will never be able to debate because we don't even see the same messages. Also, I would argue it's not somebody who just saw one ad and suddenly their mind was completely changed. It's people who've been bombarded with this daily through how these feeds are steering them. Listen, we know that disinformation is, of course, there's a difference between misinformation and disinformation, just to be clear. It's nothing new. Propaganda campaigns have existed since the beginning of time. Disinformation has existed since the beginning of communication, but never at the scale and potency of what the tools of these companies are providing. And again, we need to look at the deep reason of why is Facebook so right to be manipulated to spread incredible amounts of disinformation? Like, there's a reason. It's not just because everybody in the world is bad. And that goes back to the whole engagement attention economy stuff. But so, no, I don't think it's about, I do think voters, I will say this, we absolutely need to beef up our media literacy education for the population in general. And we absolutely need to help the general population understand how to spot misinformation, what they're reading. But what I don't like about that being the only solution is it pushes the responsibility onto us when we are up against this power that is truly manipulating the way we view news, the way we view information. And so it's this asymmetrical thing where if we say that the only responsibility is on the public to understand, listen, none of us has the time or capacity to go through a 10-step verification process of every single thing we ever see. It's just not even possible.
It's tricky, right? You watch CNN, you get one view. You watch Fox, you get a completely different view. And it's like, how do you know what to believe? And it's difficult.
Well, at least with Fox and CNN, I mean, I don't know where to classify CNN anymore, but let's look at Fox and MSNBC since they are two clearly like opposite sides of the fence. At least, and I don't approve of any tactics that are intentionally sowing disinformation, but at least you know what you're getting with those two. You know that they have an agenda. You know that Fox News's agenda is on one side and MSNBC's is on the other. And I could talk about Fox News till I turn blue in the face. But that's with these online platforms. You don't. That's also a big difference.
Right. Going back a little bit about the data stuff we were talking about, years ago, there was that shooter in, where was he? It was in California. Was it Bakersfield? I don't know. It was somewhere in California. Remember, there was a shooter and the iPhone was locked and the FBI wanted to unlock the iPhone and Apple refused to crack the iPhone for them. Do you remember that?
I do.
It's not exactly what we're talking about, but it's still around data privacy. Did you agree with Apple in that case, or what are your thoughts in those types of examples? Do you think that that there are cases where the government should be allowed to step in?
So without getting into that specific case, listen, part of the problem is it's also about which government you trust at which time, right? So I've worked on both sides of this fence. I do think we need to get to a point where we can figure out listen, government's job is to protect the people of this country. And I know there's a slippery slope of government intrusion, but do you also want government in the most extreme situations, whether it's child sexual exploitation, whether it's terrorism, whatever it is, to have no ability to also prosecute those kinds of crimes? So I'm going to be honest, this is a really complicated conversation. I don't have a clear-cut answer on it. I do think we have to find a way. I don't necessarily know that the government should have been able to break in through a back door in that particular example, which is what that example was. It's funny. I know that like post Snowden, and no, I don't want to talk about Snowden, but I know like post that era, it's all the reasons not to trust government. Well, I think right now we have all the reasons not to trust the big social media platforms, especially Facebook. So great. Now you've all lost trust. Can we come back to the table now and figure out how government and the tech industry can work together more closely to safeguard democracy? And yes, I do believe that actually involves being very careful about where government lines can and can't be drawn, just as much as where text lines can and can't be drawn. But it's not an absolutist all or nothing. It's not all government is bad or all tech industry is bad.
Well, that's what makes it complicated, right? If it were that easy, we wouldn't be talking here.
Yeah, of course.
Lastly, where can people find out more about you?
I will say on a little upswing of a note here, because everything sounds doom and gloom with me. You know, if you are an entrepreneur looking to actually tackle some of these issues, I just joined Beta Lab as a researcher in residence. I would check them out. You can just look up Beta Lab through betaworks. They are really looking for companies to invest in who want to tackle a lot of these problems. So you can find me there. Or, I mean, on my website is all of the things I publish and speak about. The one thing you didn't ask, but I'm going to answer is what can you do ahead of November 3rd? And what you can do ahead of November...
That was on my list.
What we can do ahead of November 3rd is, for me personally, I will continue to use my voice every single day to try to hold the platforms accountable for their effects on our election. You can just get involved. Like, help educate people on why they need to vote, how they can vote, steering them away from all the chaos they're seeing online right now, steer them towards reliable sources, steer them towards the actual states' sites about elections. And if this stuff concerns you, call your congressperson, call your senator. You don't have to have the answers. You just have to tell them that this is an issue, and you hope that as your representative, that they are concerned about how these companies are affecting our democracy.
Well, thank you so much for joining on the show today. I know that you are high in demand, get pulled into a lot of different directions, and you're saying no to most things. And I feel honored and thankful that you decided to come on the show today.
It was a fun conversation. I like being challenged. You challenged me. It's a good time. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in today, and I hope you enjoyed my chat with Yael. I think that there's clearly a lot to think about when it comes to social media platforms and their effects on the upcoming election. And I think it's extremely important to get perspectives from people like Yael so we can make our own educated decisions. Today's episode, you can find the show notes and other resources if you head over to getleverage.com/podcast/66. And you'll also see on that site, there's a way for you to book a call if you would like to chat with someone at Leverage about how we might be able to help you with your operational efficiency or your marketing. As always, don't forget to rate the show, subscribe, and share. We definitely don't want you to miss any future episodes that we have coming out. We have some really awesome ones in the pipeline that we are excited to be releasing. And see you next time.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Leverage Podcast from getleverage.com. Please let us know what you think. Rate and subscribe on iTunes. Leverage is an on-demand outsourcing platform that helps small business owners and entrepreneurs scale their business. We have experts that can help set up marketing and sales funnels, your email marketing, podcasts, social media creation, paid media, and much more. Grow your business overnight with a team of experts you can trust to deliver. Accomplish more. Visit getleverage.com.